Tech.
Welcome back, everybody. Tane Nix here. Welcome back to the Expat Files. I have a very special guest today, a gentleman that I know through a sort of international wealth building, wealth protection organization, is how I first met him. That's the Mavericks Project. We have a live event coming up in Dallas. There's a link below this video if you're interested. You want to come meet some of the most accomplished people you'll ever encounter in this lifetime. Please come see us in Dallas in early November. My guest today is somebody who I admire for his thinking, and I try to, and I recommend for everybody, try to be in touch with people who think clearly. The more exposure you get to people who have really thought through some of the very important issues that we're dealing with today, from global tensions and geopolitics and assassinations and what to do with your wealth, and also, of course, at the bottom of all of this, like, the why bother part is how to live your best life. And my guest today is Matthew Piepenburg. He's one of the he's one of the really smart guys in finance you're going to hear from, but he's also a stand-up guy. And I asked him to come on, and we're going to talk about some of the things that I admired when I first heard him talk about some of the themes that we'll touch on today. And so away we go. Matthew, thanks very much for your time. I'm very happy to have this chance to talk to you. I appreciate you coming on.
Well, it's a very kind introduction, and I'm really looking forward to swapping thoughts with you too. So let's dig in.
Outstanding. Outstanding. Let's begin with so that people know a little bit on your background, because you have an amazing story about how you ended up here at your place in Switzerland, where
Mhm.
the polo pictures in the back attest to your hobbies. And hilariously enough, I spent a year in Zugerberg, just
Ah,
up the hill
yeah,
from Zug. I
yeah.
taught school at it was an old hotel,
Hmm.
like very old hotel that was converted into a boarding school. I taught
Hmm.
English, obviously, and then
Yeah.
history. I was
And
25 at the time. I thought I died and went to heaven. I'm from Virginia, and I went to college in at University of Virginia in Charlottesville, and it's
love it,
very
love it,
reminiscent. Like, yeah,
love
Switzerland
it.
is very similar. And so
Yeah,
I would
yeah.
take, on a Thursday, because I had no classes on Friday, I would take my camping gear and I would just set off into the Alps, and I would just hike around and get
Oh yeah,
lost. A student there
yeah,
actually gave me a motorcycle, so I got to drive around Switzerland on a motorcycle. So I mean, it was an unbelievable
yeah,
year for me, and a very transformative year, because I didn't really know what
yeah.
I was doing up until then. I got this job, and then from there, like, I'm literally still on. I can honestly say I'm still on that same journey that took me
Mhm.
to Switzerland back in 1997. And I jumped
Mhm.
on a sailboat and I sailed and I ended up in Cuba, and I met a medicine
Wow.
man in Guatemala, and I studied medicine. I had this unbelievable adventure, but it all started with going abroad. And for me, the big thing, the two big lessons on Europe. Sorry for the long intro here.
Hmm.
The two big lessons on Europe was the immensity of the tragedy that took place there, starting in
Hmm.
1914, and then
Hmm. Yeah,
dissatisfied with the results, they did it all over again.
yeah,
Just the enormity of what happened there from the highest
yeah.
culture that we knew of, right? I mean, you could argue
Hmm.
China too, but right, in terms of Western
Hmm.
culture, this is the cradle and
Hmm.
the pantheon of Western civilization, and how they just
Yeah,
blew their brains out, not once but twice. And then,
yeah.
well, maybe that's enough of an introduction, but talk about how you went international and what happened to you, right, as you
Hmm.
got out of law school and sort of started down your own path, and then we'll pick it
Hmm.
up from there.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're from Virginia. I spent many, many years of my life in Virginia, and talk about a history of sadness too during the Civil War in the U.S. And I've been to every battlefield from Gaines Mill and to Pennsylvania and Maryland and
Bull
Sharpsburg,
Run.
Antietam, Bull Run, of course,
Yep.
Manassas. So, when you mentioned Europe and in my exposure to Europe too, since I was a child, I've been between the US and Europe from the Midwest, German families, a lot of German immigrants came to the US, and then a lot of time in Virginia. Those are two of the states, very different states that I call home. But from a teenage years on, I was also educated in Germany. Half my family's German. You mentioned the difference in the cultures are fascinating. They're all interesting and they're all valuable, but you have to sometimes leave your home state or your home country to understand yourself and the world a little differently. But certainly one thing I got from living in Germany, especially in the 80s as a kid, in the 80s, a lot of the veterans were still alive. And on my side of the family in America, a lot of American veterans, and I got to know a lot of German veterans. And of course, there's no real glory in war. There's just suffering. There's different perspectives. And I also live in France and studied in Germany and work in Switzerland. So if anyone is familiar with living in a small village in France or a city in France, it's the same in Europe, in Germany, Spain, Italy. You can't go to a village without seeing a monument to the First War and of course to the Second War, and the suffering is unimaginable. It's unimaginable. It's hard to conceive, especially for Americans who haven't really spent time in Europe. The grandparents' generation, even when I moved here 25 years ago, you couldn't go to a pub without meeting an old fella and talking about the wars, and you couldn't meet a family that wasn't affected by it. And it does broaden your awareness of the fragility of things. We're stepping beyond just finance, currencies, markets, gold, just human suffering because of poor leadership, dishonest leadership, desperate policies. War is the most desperate of all policies, as Hemingway said. When a country goes broke, the first thing you'll see is temporary prosperity from inflation and debasing the currency, and then you'll see the permanent ruin of war. And when we look around ourselves today in 2025, whether it's proxy wars or hot wars, what do we see? Currency debasement and war. It's very sad. I have a son who's 28, who's French citizen, a U.S. citizen too, but no one I talk to in the UK, France, or Germany wants to send their kids off to war over some of these things. And yet, policymakers, as you and I were joking or talking before, these are, and I know many, many people who are veterans of Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere. These are true lions being led by donkeys, which was a phrase used in the First War. But if you march through the cemeteries of the Argonne, or you go to the Belgian border, or you go near the border with France and Germany, just the American dead, the French dead, the British dead, the German, it's heartbreaking. And so just this idea of the fragility of things in this context of how you understand history, and even how you understand markets and currencies and desperate policies, as you get closer and closer to desperate times, policies, including military policies, become more and more desperate, more and more disconnected from what the actual people want, what parents want, what they want for their children. It is heartbreaking to see it, whether it's in Israel, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's in Ukraine, which is appalling, the death toll there. Again, not taking a left or right side, a hawk or dove side. I think we can all agree, especially any of us who have family or relations in the military, it's on the back of your mind at all times. And when I'm talking about bond spreads and credit markets, or equity bubbles, or precious metals, or currency debasement, in the back of my mind is always the larger picture of the human tragedies that can come from these very fragile systems that, in my mind, are coming apart. And I hope Hemingway's wrong. I hope we're wrong. I hope that the problems we're seeing in the currencies, the social unrest we're seeing in the U.S., the polarization there, the disconnect between governments and the people in Europe, whether that's France, Germany, the UK, I see it every day.
If you think offshore structures like where to bank, how to invest in foreign real estate, and where to set up your foreign trust are difficult or complicated, they're not. That's not the hard part of creating an international lifestyle. The hardest part is the decision to go. That's why I wrote Secrets of the Expat Adventure, to share with you a deeply personal view of what happens when you decide to cast off the chains of a normal life full of predictable outcomes. I don't want to spoil the ending for you, but you quickly discover yourself living your best life, the life you were meant to live, instead of the one you're stuck with. Across 156 pages, I'll share the incredible adventure I've enjoyed because of my decision to leave my old life behind and create an international lifestyle. I lay out for you the consequences of remaining in a life or location where everything is familiar, contrasting that with the almost magical growth and gain that is possible once you decide to take the path of adventure. There's something deeply mysterious about choosing an adventurous life. Once you commit, helpers appear, and events seem to unfold in an almost magically choreographed manner. You find yourself learning, living, and loving your life in a way that you thought you'd lost forever. There is no financial gain that compares with the recovery of the best parts of yourself. Fortunately, the decision to internationalize is also a great way to get wealthy. I give you real examples of how much easier it was for me to find and profit from the real estate and other investment opportunities I came across simply by choosing to play on the very uneven playing field of developing markets. If you're worried about what's happening in your home country and you're on the fence about whether or not you should create your own plan B, Secrets of the Expat Adventure will give you clarity and inspiration to choose your own path of freedom and adventure. I promise you'll never look at your life the same way again once you discover what an international lifestyle can do for you, your family, and your wealth. To get your copy, click the link below this video.
I hope none of this leads to further social unrest, violence, and certainly military solutions. There's very few that are working right now. But that's always in the back of my mind. And to your point, coming from America, coming from Charlottesville, or coming from Virginia to Europe, you get a whole new idea, a bigger perspective of how things can go from the sublime to the ridiculous, as Napoleon said, very quickly. And I hope we're not heading deeper into the ridiculous, but I'm not that optimistic, Tane, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. I mean,
Mhm.
for perspective, I know there was I'm a bit of a buff of the so-called Great War, as it was
Mhm.
known. In
Mhm.
August of 1914, when hostilities broke out, I think it was August 21st or 23rd, whatever the exact date was,
Mhm.
30,000 Frenchmen died in a
Yeah.
day. In
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
day, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
we had on the scale of the killing that took place there. My point here is not to harp on, sort of grotesqueries, but
Mhm.
that people who are cheering on and antagonizing and doing a little dance and a jig after the death of Charlie
Mhm.
Kirk really
Yep.
just I mean it's
Yep.
if it's not just distasteful, you have to stop and realize like none of these people understand what war actually is.
Right.
None of the people understand like watching your family members get raped and murdered and like your
Mhm.
children being murdered in front of you and like you
Mhm.
understand like
Yep.
the deprivation of it and the betrayal and all things that you counted on collapsing and not working. um so nobody should be excited about the antagonism that is going on. We should all be very much, we are
Right.
on pins and needles
Yep.
here. And I too, it's very hard to be optimistic, but we try.
Mhm. Yep.
And for the moment, at least, there are, and we will get to solutions because I know you work for a firm there that is
Mhm.
mostly tailored to super high net worth people, which is
Mhm.
fine, but that people should still know about. So we'll make sure there's a plug at the end here. But
Mhm.
uh, you have a whole machine working for preservation
Mhm.
of wealth and for getting
Mhm.
through chaotic times, just like we're in now. You guys saw this coming. So talk about
Mhm.
your early days in finance and sort of how
Mhm.
you got set up in Switzerland, working with the people you now work with, and sort of how that happened and how you turned from your big windfall toward gold and what that sort of awakening was about.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of important lessons I learned growing up and how I got from, the Midwest and Europe to markets and to gold and what gold can do. To your point, we represent very high net worth individuals for gold storage and gold transport, gold insurance, and then liquidity into fiat when needed out of Zurich. And again, our clients are very, very wealthy and they're institutional and private, but 99% of the time that I'm speaking to the man on the street because I am the man on the street. I'm from a very small Midwestern town. I grew up in a very lower middle class family. I had a lot of sports scholarships to get to good fancy prep schools in the New England and then to Ivy League schools and grad schools. I was very blessed, but I had to work for that. There was no white privilege. It was just hard work. That was the Midwest attitude that my German grandparents taught me and my parents taught me. But I came out of grad school as a young attorney and I practiced for about 10 minutes. And this was during the late 90s when the dot com and the internet was going to change everything. And the dot com, like an AI prefix or suffix, would make you rich overnight. And in some ways, that was true. There was a craze that Charlie McKay would call the madness of crowds when that dot
Mhm.
com bubble hit in the NASDAQ. And I've said many times, a lucky idiot. I'm not immodest about that. It was true. A very good friend of mine then and now. We started with some family wealth from his side of the family. He had an investment banking background. We were just buying pre-IPOs in the dot-com era in the late 90s out of Robbie Stevens. Goldman Sachs was underwriting. And we were literally, as I've said again and again, lottery ticket winners.
Mhm.
And that was fine. And we knew it. I knew it. But that was luck. But it took some cojones and it took some self-knowledge to realize you were lucky and then to be responsible for that. I know many people say, "Cry me a river." You're a dot-com punk, just like you could say a crypto punk today who's made too much money too soon. As long as you know you're lucky and not smart, then you have a chance to get smart. And so when we had some of that wealth, that led to being a family office executive and then allocating that wealth to other very smart, much smarter people like Jeremy Grantham at GMO and Appaloosa and some of these big funds. And I was allocating a lot of consolidated money from other families and doing a lot of research on bond markets, stock markets, currency markets, real estate markets, energy markets. And that was where my real education began, kind of post lottery. And as I got years and years of experience investing money and talking to portfolio managers, talking to gold miners, talking to oil miners, talking to real estate guys, private equity guys, private credit guys, you get what Hemingway called a good BS detector. You start to separate the men from the boys, the real risk managers, the real alpha getters, and the other ones that were just rising with a rising tide and falling with a falling tide. And that was a great education. And during that time, post hedge fund, family office space. Now I'm an allocator. Now I'm getting educated. I'm in London. I'm in New York. I'm talking to the real managers who are, again, the good, the bad, and the ugly. That's when I started to learn about debt and credit markets and interest rates and yields and what that does for the US dollar, what debt does to the US dollar. I had some fascinating kind of over a beer conversations too with very smart risk asset guys in stocks and bonds, but they were already 20, 15 years ago starting to talk about gold because they were starting to understand history and what QE and mouse click money and extended and pretended policies from the Fed are doing to the US dollar and what
So what
rates have.
year was this? So we're post 2001, obviously, but
Yeah,
what
we're post
year roughly?
2001. Probably more around 2011, 12 is when I started to
Okay.
have these conversations, and people were giving me books, and I was listening to Egon von Greyer's, and I was looking at him, and I was starting to say, no matter how you make your money, whether it's speculation, whether it's real estate, whether it's a lottery ticket, whether it's an inheritance, whether it's bulletproof glass, and you have to then manage that money. And whether that's in portfolio diversification, whether it's in private equity, whether it's in hedge funds, you're still measuring your wealth in a dollar. And I started to realize from talking to these folks that a lot of them who were trading stocks and bonds or credits were buying gold and putting it in Canada or putting it in Australia or putting it in New Zealand or putting it in Zurich. And I was starting to ask myself why. And that's where the education, where you go from risk assets and stock markets and bond markets and rates and different diversification to just the dollar itself, this beautiful dollar, this ice cube that looks so fine but is melting one day at a time because of these policies. And then I became an investor in gold. And that's how I got to know Egon von Greyer's, who has the, I think, best service in the world for jurisdiction, for storage, for the vaults, for liquidity, for the services of transport. And I wanted to become a client. And then I became more than a client, I became a member of the team because I believed in the message. And since I'm half European anyway, moving from the US at the time, Virginia, moving from the U.S. To France and to Switzerland. I already had a home there. That was fine. That made perfect sense, and I felt really good about it because I believe in the narrative. So it's a long stretch from being basically a 20-something, happy idiot in the Nasdaq bubble of 2098 to 2000, to becoming a family office executive, an allocator, to then understanding physical gold, and then coming back to Europe and working with my colleague Egon von Greyerz, who's really a kind of an icon in the space, and then having a message about gold. But gold has to be understood, to our original point. Gold has to be understood in terms of history and the history of paper money, the history of bond bubbles and credit bubbles, stock bubbles, and currency debasement. And we are in that fourth turning right now. We are in that inflection point, that tipping point with the dollar and with all fiat money. And look, again, whether gold can protect us from happy idiot politicians, from mainly mad politicians, and the disgrace of what's happening with global relations and the rising risks of military conflicts in a nuclear era, which is madness. Gold can't protect us from all of those things, but we can create wealth preservation no matter what our income. We can protect ourselves from this melting ice cube. We can protect ourselves from currency debasement, which is criminal. And again, whether you can afford a gram or a kilo bar, you need to understand how to protect yourself from this slow theft of inflation, this slow theft of currency debasement. And gold can protect you in that regard, give you some financial autonomy. Whether you have $1 million or $100,000 or $10,000 or $1,000, you can start, not to get rich quick, but to protect what you've earned and to protect yourself from the criminal negligence of your policymakers, your central bankers, your left or right politicians, because they're all guilty of debasing the currency to stay elected, to get more votes, to mouse click money. That's just a sad reality. And so I speak about history, and I speak from Zurich about it, but I speak not just to high net worth clients. I speak to anyone listening who wants to take the time to understand that.
Mavericks Project is a private community focused on powerful connections, trusted information, and time-tested solutions to create and preserve wealth during our epoch of extreme change. The Mavericks Project was born out of the social, economic, and geopolitical schism that kicked off in 2020. A small band of contrarian misfits spent the lockdown years observing problems, analyzing the implications, and plotting solutions. Now, several times a year, we Mavericks get together in fun and fascinating locations to talk about solutions to the social dangers to your family's safety and how to avoid them, the increasing state surveillance and how to negate it, the rapidly declining U.S. empire and how we want to position for what's coming next, the risks to your family's generational wealth and how to protect it. If you think you have what it takes to be a maverick, this is your chance to come make new and better friends with some of the most accomplished people you will ever meet. Join us from November 4th to 7th in Dallas, Texas for 3 unforgettable days of action, discussion, and answers. The link for the event, along with all the details, is below this video. It occurs to me that when you study gold, probably this is true on other areas of finance too, but certainly when you study gold, what you end up studying is people. Because
Yeah.
again, right, the rhyme of history says, right, and if you talk to some of the old veterans that you mentioned at the top of the show, or people who lived through the Great War or the Second World War, and managed to preserve wealth or had to smuggle their wealth out, how did they do that, right? If
Yeah.
if they didn't roll up a Rembrandt and like stuff it in their cloak, right, they were
Sure.
sewing gold coins into the lining of their
Yeah.
clothing and trying to get across the border. And so you mentioned you talked to the man on the street, that's a lot of your communication is like that. What do you find, like, because the thing that still shocks me as we go through this, like as we're recording, gold top now spot price is just above $3,700. I didn't
Yeah.
check right in the last couple hours, maybe it's higher, I have no idea.
Yeah.
But point being, right, it's up another $200 like in the last 10 days.
Yeah.
And it seems like nothing's going to stop that from continuing. There's certainly no right. There's no policymaker out there who's like, by the way, I think we should stop spending so much and maybe stop
Right.
creating so much money. Like that conversation isn't being had anywhere, and
Right.
won't be, as far as we know. So, like, what
Right.
do you encounter as being like the peculiar thing that you find yourself either hearing in the form of a question or talking
Mhm.
to the man in the street about?
Mhm.
Because the big thing I see is like, do you understand? Like, gold is not going up,
Mhm.
right? I mean,
Right.
technically, your
Right.
money's just buying you less. It's not
Exactly.
complicated. So if you put some money into this pet rock, right, this
Right.
barbaric relic, as
Right.
as as guys like Buffett and goof on it, it's like,
Hmm.
but you come out the other side and you can actually buy stuff, right? As
Yep.
opposed to people who really understand what the inflation thing was about, usually because they lived through a very painful period of losing everything. So does anything
Sure.
stick out to you? Like, what do you come across when you're talking to regular?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, obviously, to your point, growing up in a family that went through World War II, and living in a village where 80% of the people lost everything, and where there are war monuments every 10 minutes. You know, my grandfather always said to me, the only real wealth is land, art, and gold. And in Switzerland, that's a truism. In America, where we're not used to having our borders infringed or our villages burned or our cities occupied, that's not so much on our mind. We do live in a certain splendid isolation for centuries. We've kind of gotten into this mentality. And I think to your point, there's to those that are even looking at gold, and that's the first question. There's so many people that don't even understand it, don't even look at it. It's a pawn shop asset. They don't look at it. They've been told it's a pet rock, etc. But even for those that do invest in gold or speculate in gold, they just keep saying gold's going higher. To your point, no, gold's only going higher in dollar prices. What's not that gold is in a bull market, it's that paper money, including the world reserve currency, the US dollar, is losing power. It's that paper money is in a dramatic bear market. It's only going to get worse. So it's not that gold somehow gets shinier or more valuable because there's a certain demand for gold because it's suddenly a better hard asset or commodity or precious metal. It is a monetary metal and it's rising because currency is falling like a rock off a cliff. And it's now becoming more obvious, but for years it's been kind of a slow frog boil. Since 1971, when the US got off the gold standard, the US dollar has lost 99% of its purchasing power measured against gold. Most people don't understand that. And those that are even getting into gold now still have this kind of idea that gold is this pet rock, this joke from the past. No, it's absolutely a misunderstanding. I was talking to my colleague, one of my partners who's at the a Harvard Club right now, and he was talking to a woman who works at a major bank, and they were talking about gold. And this is a pretty smart gal who went to Harvard and works for the big bank and is talking about Nvidia and Microsoft and didn't even think of gold as an investment. So this is a smart person with an education in finance. Now imagine if they have a hard time tracking and figuring out gold. The man on the street has an even harder time. And I think it's
Hmm.
more important. The common sense of the man on the street, though, I have hope for, and I still
Hmm.
believe in it. But one of the things I've seen is when you have a debt-soaked country like the US with such criminal mismanagement of its monetary policy, in particular since 71, left or right, every president, every Congress, every central bank, banker since has been completely guilty of just drunken driving. But when you're that broke and you're that desperate, there's a lot of dishonesty. One of the dishonesties I see is there's no recession. Well, that's quantifiably not true. Or that there's no inflation, or that it's transitory. That's quantifiably not true. The other big lie I've seen in my career in the last 25 years is that gold is too volatile. It's not a real asset. And this is fascinating to me because, ironically, just stepping back, gold is, if you're looking at it purely as a speculation play, has outperformed the S&P for the last 25 years. Now you can pick your
Dramatically. Yep.
dramatically. You
Yep.
can pick your statistical window, et cetera, but come on, for 25 years, it's returned 11 times its value. The S&P's returned 7 times, and yet it's still considered too volatile. So
Mhm.
there is a you could say conspiracy theory or tinfoil hatted belief, but I think it's absolutely true from the grad school to today. Gold is deliberately misunderstood. It's deliberately downplayed at private wealth management offices at JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs or Pictet or Rothschild. They deliberately don't want you to understand gold, especially in the US. It wasn't taught in grad school. It wasn't taught in economics other than a historical relic. But the reason gold is intentionally misunderstood and downplayed is because gold is an embarrassment to a failing fiat system. It's an
Bingo.
embarrassment to a failed central bank policy. It's an embarrassment to Nixon. When Nixon got off the gold standard, he had two other lies. He said, your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as today. That's 100% not true. And he also said that this decoupling from gold would be temporary. So that was two lies right off the bat. And even prior to decoupling from gold back in 1971, that patient zero moment of the ripple effect misery we're in today, the Fed and the FOMC and other policymakers were going in front of Congress and saying, not only are we going to get off the gold standard, that's going to be good for the dollar. Gold is actually holding the dollar back. And
Yeah.
by the way, the gold price is going to tank once we decouple. Again, two massive lies from the experts, from those donkeys leading lions. It's just a history of lies. Gold is up 8,000% since 1971. They said gold would go down, and the dollar's lost 99%, and it's outperformed the biggest stock bubble I've seen and studied. So yet it's too volatile. So you have to look at this dishonesty. So for the man on the street to understand that, if a woman works at a major bank can't understand that, is a huge challenge. I give Egon von Greyer's a ton of credit and others in this space for decades, because now there's a lot of Johnny come latelys in the gold space, sudden gold experts getting the clicks, jumping on, talking about gold like they've understood it for years. Whereas folks like Egon or Simon Hunt or Jim Sinclair, Maloney, these guys have been warning this for years, and you got to give them credit. You really do. And yet it's so hard for individuals who have a mortgage, kids in school, a job, 9 to 5, trying to make their way, to take time to sit and think about monetary policy, debt, and what that does to the dollar and currency debasement. It's not impossible, and it has to be done. I think a lot of people on Main Street, though, are so worried about just surviving, and a lot of them are trying to speculate to get more money out of this rising S&P, which we can talk about as well. But I can't blame them for trying to get more. What we're talking about is trying to preserve what you have. And if you're really stretched and you're just trying to get through the month, you don't have the high class problem of trying to preserve your wealth. So a lot of people don't even want to think about these things. But the irony is, you have to preserve your purchasing power because the dollar won't do it for you. And yeah, when Egon and I started buying gold, when Egon bought gold, it was $300 an ounce. It's now, as you said, 3,700. So it does have speculation or price optionality example. It's very a good outperforming stock, but we're still arguing regardless of the price, because we don't measure wealth in dollars, we measure it in ounces, in grams. You still have to protect your money. You still need life insurance for your dying currency. And now with prices getting higher, it's harder and harder to buy an ounce of gold, even an ounce of silver for some people. We can talk about silver too, but I'm saying I understand why it's misunderstood. It's been deliberately downplayed, frankly, ridiculed and ignored by the mainstream media, by the private wealth management offices, by commercial banks, by the RIA industrial complex. So it's very hard for people to understand gold. They have to go online. They have to educate themselves. The online space is full of all kinds of kooks and quacks, smarts and geniuses and fools. So then you have to find your fiduciary online. That can be very difficult too. So it's a huge challenge. But I think now, because debt is becoming so obvious, because trust in the government, left or right, is becoming so polarized, because the inflation, which is completely and dishonestly reported, I mean, that's a Wall Street secret. Everyone knows the CPI scale, which has been modified 22 times since 1980, is an open lie. But regardless of whether you know what the CPI versus the PCE is, or whether you know what the Fed policy does to the dollar, even if you're an innocent in the markets, every citizen of the US knows that their $10 or $20 bill doesn't buy nearly what it did 5 years ago, 4 years ago, 10 years ago, or a year ago. They feel the inflation. They don't need an expert to tell them what that is. And so now gold is making headlines, and it's getting attention. And I think that's fantastic. But
Yeah.
the struggle is always going to be, can a simple person with not a lot of free cash flow afford to take a little gold on? As Egon and I have said, whether it's a gram or an ounce or a milligram, start, because it's not about getting rich, but if you're measuring your wealth in that ice cube, that US dollar, even though it is the world reserve currency, even though it is relatively better than other currencies, it's being stolen from you every day by this slow drip of inflation, which is an invisible tax. On top of the taxes that you are paying, you're
Yeah.
getting the invisible tax of inflation. And that is what creates social unrest. That is what polarizes a society. That is why we have the largest wealth equality in the history of our country. At the same time, we have the largest debt in the history of capital markets. It's no coincidence that things are breaking down, from transgender bathrooms to BLM to left versus right in the US, to where coalition governments here in Europe are failing and trust is failing. So these things are all connected to debt. And I know it seems like a huge stretch, but when you're financially strapped and stressed, and your currency is an insult to what you need to buy every month, now gold is coming back to the conversation. And there's nothing Harvard Business School can do to change that. Politicians can do to change that. Hell, they're even talking about gold revaluation now, when they've been making fun of gold for years. Gold is coming back up because currencies have lost credibility,
It's
and
coming.
currencies have lost credibility because our politicians have absolutely screwed us with decades of misuse monetary policy. Just
Well,
appalling.
one of the things, so back to our study of human beings, right?
Mhm.
What you're describing is, I don't know that it's unique to this moment in history. I'm sure you could find multiple parallels. And if we lived in another time and we could actually see, like, no, these
Mhm.
people are just as clueless too. But, you mentioned, I think Nassim Taleb called them intellectual yet idiots,
Mhm.
right? Like a
Mhm.
Harvard trained
Yep.
finance guru, specialist, PhD has
Mhm.
trouble wrapping her head around why it might be a wise time and a good idea at this point in the historical cycle to stick some money in gold so that it's there on the
Right.
other side of whatever chaos is coming. But like the guy who
Mhm.
drives a UPS truck, right? And
Mhm.
these guys actually get paid pretty well, for example,
Mhm.
um, can grasp
Yep.
the concept of like, all right, I got paid this week or I got paid this month. Let me go, let
Mhm.
me get down to the coin shop, or let me get online
Mhm.
and have a coin. Like I was
Mhm.
buying gold. It was 1050 was my first receipt. So this was
Wow.
2015. Yeah.
Wow.
And I
Yeah.
mean, I didn't have any money before that. So,
Yeah.
and I took my time, right? My money making
Mhm.
year, I'm 54 now, and my money
Mhm.
making years came way later because of certain things that I was doing. I talk about this elsewhere, so I won't rehash it here, but I was working on board big cruise ships, and I would get paid. You get paid once a week,
Mhm.
direct deposit into your account, and I would go online right away and I would buy a
Mhm.
gold coin. And they
Yeah.
shipped
Fantastic.
it to the ship. It would come in the mailroom in, Alaska or whenever we would pick up the mail. And
Yeah.
I'd run down there. I was like, this is impossible. Like, if anybody knows what's in here, there's no way they couldn't,
Right.
like help themselves
Yeah.
too. But it's insured and all the rest. And I was buying usually maple leafs
Mhm.
and then sovereigns. And then right when I actually made serious money, eventually, when I
Mhm.
went to work for a publisher, I was buying gold in like $100,000 tranches. I mean, I was
Wow.
buying gold like I was as
Mhm.
unsophisticated as you could be about
Mhm.
finance, and I was working for a financial newsletter publication company, but I
Mhm.
understood gold. I
Mhm.
understood. I was like, well, if I
Yep.
just made a bunch of money and I don't really want to gamble with this, I'm just going to stick it in gold. And yes,
Yeah.
there's storage fees, and yes, you got to figure out a safe place to keep it and all the rest, however you're going to do that. But it's
Yep.
like, what a genius I look like and feel like now. Is it tops three? I'm up well over 100% on most of my
Yeah.
gold holdings. I didn't buy everything at 1050, obviously, but
Mhm.
it's like anybody can. My point is, anybody can do this. Like
Right.
anybody can just like whatever it is, like 10% of your income gets allocated to this dopey precious metal that
Yep.
sits there and does nothing because, and this is where I was going with this, you're a fabulous dot connector. And my old boss, Bill Bonner, also like
Mhm.
what a wonderful
Yeah.
mind and what a great
Yeah.
writer,
Yep.
tremendous thinker.
Yep.
But where are we in the cycle? Because, right, you mentioned like there is a time to make money, right? If
Hmm.
the Fed's gonna print money and drop from helicopters and everybody's allowed to get rich, like awesome, get
Yeah.
rich in .com stocks or whatever, like get
Yeah.
pre-IPO stuff. Like you did that, but like
Hmm.
there is a part of the cycle too. It's like don't blow up. Like rule number
Right.
one, rule number two,
Right.
like don't lose money.
Right.
So where are we now, and what do you see? Obviously, everybody's aware of the news. I'll be surprised if we get through the week without something else shocking happening. Everybody knows what
Right.
happened. Today's September 16th. Terrible events in Utah last week. And
Hmm.
sadly, this is part of what we're going to go through. And there's going to be,
Yep.
I think there's going to be plenty more violence and plenty more assassinations. And
Hmm.
so, what part of the cycle are we in, according to you and your firm and your research? What do you see? And sort of,
Hmm.
we'll get to the part about what the hell to do about it next.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I've done so many interviews for over the years, and one I did at a conference in Germany in Frankfurt, and I did one in English and I did one in German. And the English title of this YouTube video, which has less hits than 90% of everything else I've done, it's the one I'm most proud of. And it's called The Faces and Cycles of Gold. I think this was 3 years ago. And it literally, to your question, talks about how this is nothing new. In fact, this happened in a major way: QE to dollar debasement to social corruption to revolution and war. It's a very simplistic but very clear history of cycles. And you see this exact pattern in 1789 France, pre-Napoleon, when the French had this idea of QE to the moon. Basically, they called it something else, the National Assembly. There's a guy named Necker, but he was just like Greenspan, and there were politicians who said, let's just print money to solve a debt crisis. And what that did was become addictive. They had the first printing of assignats, they were called, then they had the second, and then the third, and they said, well, this is beautiful. This will make all our problems go away. And of course, all it did was destroy the country, destroy the currency, and lead to the guillotine and revolution. Now, I'm
It
not
is a
saying
kind of madness. I mean, it
it
is
is,
a kind of madness. They're like,
yeah,
why didn't we think of this before? We can just print money and
right.
buy anything we want. It's like, well,
And
because
yet
it doesn't work, because
it
you end up
doesn't
getting your
work.
head chopped off. Yeah, right.
And even in 1789, they had 1720 John Law era as in another example of
Hmm.
how this doesn't work. And the Romans did it and it didn't work. The Chinese did it, it didn't work. So this is nothing new, actually, if you look at the history of it. So that's just an interesting thing that I think you should look at: the phases and cycle of gold. You can literally quantifiably see how similar this is to disasters in the past. And that's kind of fascinating for me. In terms of where we are in the US or in the world right now, we're clearly at that fourth turning. We're at that point where there is no way out. There is no easy way out. And again, you have to answer that with boring things. We won't get into the weeds of bond markets and yields and debt and credit. But look, it's very simple. The patient zero in the room is the debt crisis in the US. 37 trillion is an unsustainable amount. It's an unpayable amount. I said it's unfassbar, unvorstellbar in Germany. It's just unbelievable. And there's no cure for that. I've said Trump, Biden, Harris, Santa Claus, Papa Smurf, no one's going to solve that. And the cause of that started in August 15th, 1971, when we went off the gold standard, which Article 1 of our Constitution said never to do, because if you do that, you'll kill the currency, you'll get addicted to it, and you'll destroy the country. It's in the
You'll destroy the
first
country.
article of our Constitution. And in 1971, Nixon put the nail in the coffin on that. And that was because of self-interest and politics, and then the economic fantasy of modern monetary theory that we could do this without killing the currency. All of these lies. And so now, 54 years later, we're well past an easy solution. As I've said, we've had consequences. The first consequence is a currency debasement. The second consequence is lies, like about recessions, about inflation, about gold volatility. The third consequence is desperation, political lies. You could argue, and I will argue, that Trump is certainly more audacious, more active, more mentally there than Biden. That's not being left or right. We all know that. Whether you love or hate him, he's trying. There's these desperate attempts that tariffs will save us, stablecoin will save us, Doge cuts will save us, US aid will save us, AI will save us, gold revaluation will save us. Now, that's to me audacious and energetic, but it's totally unhelpful, because all of those things to me are signs that we could get into the weeds of each and we won't have time. But if you look at each of those verticals, they're not a solution to 37 trillion and counting in debt. And when you get to a debt crisis, you always get to a currency crisis. A currency crisis always, without exception, throughout history, leads to inflation. Inflation leads to wealth inequality. It leads to desperation. It leads to social unrest. And without exception, from Ming to Rome to today, social unrest is always solved by extreme centralization from the left or the right, the extreme left or the extreme right. And that's where we're at now with a lot of reasons we can give of desperation and centralization, the erosion of all of the kind of civil liberties that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights was there to protect is always under threat. We've already seen the dollar die. We've already seen many of the other Bill of Rights die with the Patriot Act in the last crisis at 9/11, post 9/11. So we are at that cycle where we've gone from debt to inflation to social unrest to centralization, central bank digital currency. Stablecoin is just central bank digital currency from private issuers instead of a central bank. So it's still programmable, it's still trackable, it's still seizable. So that is already a sign of desperation and centralization. I mean, COVID, whatever you think of COVID, again, I'm not getting into that weeds. We saw a massive decline in civil liberties during that period. That was a sign of centralization. What Trudeau did with the truckers in Canada, what Europe and the US, what we did globally to citizens' rights. It's not a debate about whether COVID's good or bad, but there was a massive deformation of our civil liberties, which many people have not recovered from. Many of the folks in Mavericks became Mavericks because of the psychological, financial, and political reaction to that massive piece of historical centralization. But that cycle of debt to centralization, of social unrest and war is exactly where we are now. And I think, again, if you have a crypto dollar, an e-dollar, an e-euro, an e-yen, you have a stable coin that's being inflated. We had Bitcoin as the entry drug to get us into the blockchain technology, the DLT. I'm not going to get into argument about gold versus Bitcoin. I'm just saying this idea, this slow drip to seduce us, the sirens that seduce us into the rocks of tokenization of all things, including the dollar, makes those things more controllable and certainly more seizable. If you and I write the wrong article, join the wrong group, have the wrong opinion, have the wrong social score, you will have your e-dollar frozen. Not to mention it will be debased overnight at some point. Even the Russians see this coming. We're going to tokenize more dollars, we're going to debase it, and then we're going to reset things with gold. But I'm saying we are at that point where we're seeing the centralization, we're seeing the polarization in politics, we're seeing the distrust and the lack of credibility. And we are trying to protect ourselves precisely from these tokenized programmable, trackable assets, these centralization assets, because governments don't have an easy solution to the debt crisis. They will debase the currency, whether it's an e-dollar or a paper dollar, that will be debased. The problem with the tokenized dollar is that can also be taken from you and tracked and monitored. To me, that is a very dangerous sign for anyone who understands their civil liberties, let alone whether they understand gold versus the dollar or money
Let's
versus
peel.
currency.
Let me just ask you a question there.
Mhm,
I have a theory that the
mhm,
Chinese system is the future. And
mhm,
the reason is because every politician in the West is deeply enamored. I was going to use a vulgar metaphor, but deeply, deeply jealous
mhm,
that these
mhm,
people have figured out how to control. And I'm not saying like I imagine she wakes up in a cold sweat from time to time trying to hold
sure.
a country of a
Mhm,
billion people together. Obviously, I have
right.
not been to China physically. I studied a lot of Chinese medicine, and I know a thing or two about the culture, but I have not been there, so I don't know what the situation is on the ground. I'm told it's quite
Mhm,
nice, right? These people have
mhm,
really outdone themselves,
mhm,
modernizing. Everybody knows the Chinese miracle. They pulled like 800 million people out of severe,
mhm,
like starvation level kind of penury and poverty. And
mhm,
so, what would be the upside? Let's say we're headed into a very Chinese looking future because their
mhm,
system clearly works. It worked for
mhm,
them. I mean, we
mhm.
could have a discussion about whether or not it would work for like gun toting Americans, like being
Right.
centralized and centrally controlled. But it
Mhm,
does appear to me that there is an inevitability out there. I mean, you
mhm,
see, for example, the U.S. government is now buying shares in companies that it deems strategically important. Well, that's a
mhm,
Chinese feature. That's a
mhm,
feature of their
mhm,
form of capitalism, which is really a kind of national capitalism or nationalized capitalism, where
mhm.
the government also says, like, look, we need you, like we need you
Mhm.
to make weapons or to help, our one road, what's it called, the
The
one.
Silk Road.
Yes, the Silk
Yeah,
Road.
Silk
I
Road. Yep.
one bridge, one belt, one road initiative. Excuse
Yep.
me.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm,
and I mean that project is going forward full steam ahead, and BRICS and all the
mhm,
rest. Like they've determined, like we're going to have winners in our economy, and
mhm,
it's very antithetical to the way
Mhm.
that the West and the US in particular, which is definitely like the cradle of finance in the West. I mean, you
Mhm.
know, the one thing the US people got right, like we really know how to run money, right? And
Mhm.
companies
Mhm.
and Wall Street and all the rest. Like obviously it's been so dominant for so long, but it does
Mhm.
appear to me that the centralization theme is impossible to avoid. Like the
Mhm.
future of
Mhm.
centralized money and the government's going to prop up, this miner, for example. Like they bought some miner in California too, right? And they have like
Mhm.
a
Mhm.
controlling share in Intel and et cetera, et cetera. And they
Mhm.
get warrants along with the deal. And so it's
Mhm.
like if that's coming, is there a silver lining? Like, so maybe Tane and Matt can't have a conversation and say things that the government doesn't approve of, but maybe it's a
Right.
really nice, pleasant society because there is no crime. Like, there's just,
Mhm.
like
Yeah.
maybe there's an upshot. I'm just
Mhm.
looking for ways here to sort of like, if this is inevitable and this is coming, is it
Right.
going to be good on any level, or are we all just going to get like Orwell's famous image, right? A boot
Right.
stomping on a human face for eternity.
No, these are great questions, Tane. I mean, this my good friend Francis Hunt, the market sniper. He has just as cynical
Love
of
him.
views as anyone, and he says, "Well, if I'm going to be a slave, I at least want to be a wealthy slave. I'm gonna own my gold. I know I'm going to be centralized. I know there's more control. We are going more east, like where there's this kind of hybrid autocracy with some illusion of democracy. We're not going to have the same freedoms. We've lost so many freedoms already in the last 20 years. It's accelerating now. Tokenization is coming." I at least want to be protected financially, and I realize I'm losing some of my. It's a feudalistic society. It is what it is. Nothing you and I are going to do is going to change that, short of revolution, which no one wants because it's always bloody and messy. We bend the knee to the tokenization, the centralization that's coming, but at least I'll be wealthy, or at least I'll be protected. And so you're just making a realistic concession to the realpolitik of this turning point in history. And that's one way to look at it. I am still a Virginian to your, in a sense, I'm more of a Virginian than I am a Midwestern. And Virginia is the home of some of the greatest founding fathers, flawed white men, but had fantastic ideas. And,
Brilliant.
give me liberty or give me death isn't an exaggeration to me, or Thomas Paine and these other figures. And again, though flawed, they did before they wrote the Constitution, they wrote the Declaration. Thomas Jefferson, right outside of Charlottesville. What did he say? If your government, in that case King George, the mad King George, is lying to you and stealing from you taxation without representation, you have a right as a patriot, as a citizen, to question that government. So before I become a slave and before I become a revolutionary, I'd like to see if we can change things. That's probably very Pollyannish, but the Virginian in me is appalled because Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, um, the whole gang that met in Philadelphia and met later in Virginia and met in Boston and John Adams up north, all of them would be appalled by the America that we have today. I know they would be. If you study your founding fathers, this is not the civil liberties, not even the dollar that we wanted. Thomas Jefferson and Hamilton argued about a central bank, but we agreed that we should have a gold backed dollar. They would all be appalled. They would be revolutionary today. The problem is, like the truckers in Canada, they probably couldn't get together with their iPhones before being tracked as a threat to national security. To me, that's very sad. I think that's something we're willing to fight for. Maybe that's too polarizing for YouTube auditors. And I'm not here to spread violence, but I'm very disappointed in the trajectory, the slow death of American democracy. Whether China is the new model, again, as someone from Virginia or Michigan, or a true, patriotic American who lives half of my life overseas, you can love your country and still be critical of it. In fact, the more you love it, the more you should be critical of it because it can be better than this. I don't
Amen.
want to live in Shanghai. I don't want to live in St. Petersburg. But there's much we can learn from the honesty and the policies of even the Russians and the Chinese, who are openly autocratic with democratic sideshows. We're openly democratic with autocratic hidden tendencies. But look, China has many things. Well, America has been perpetually at war for all of my life, from
All my
Vietnam to
life.
today, in some form or another. And family members of mine who were at Da Nang and all these horrible places that come back with stories, and friends of mine who went from high school to the freaking Middle East, the sandbox there. Many of them came back either suicidal or troubled. We all know these stories. And so, well, we've been at war, and Mearsheimer has said since 9/11. This is an academic out of University of Chicago, and Jeffrey Sachs out of Columbia. Smart guys, patriotic men, not anti-American, but we have to admit our foreign policy has been a disaster since 9/11 in every way. While we have been engaged in war, and while our military budget has gone to over $1 trillion a year, The Chinese have been building inroads. They've been building ports. They've been building infrastructure from Africa to South America to to Europe, and they've been avoiding the cost of war and the waste of war, and they've been practical and functional because the Chinese, love them or hate them, think like chess players, where American politicians think about re-election cycles and checkers players. That's just the reality of our system
Mhm.
and the self-interest of the left and the right, which are each pathologically dishonest, and each pathologic like cartels or competing gangs. I say they're two stirrups to the same saddle. We've been wasting our time on wars, spreading freedom and democracy. But I believe in Kissinger's quote, America has neither friends or enemies, just interests. Look, to be a friend of America is fatal. To be an enemy is dangerous. To be a friend is fatal. Look at Europe has done following us into Ukraine. It's we can spend hours on this. The policies have been a disaster. What can we learn from China? Well, it's very hard in a system like ours where politicians want to get elected by making promises they can't keep unless they mouse click money and unless they control the media and they control the message and they control the money supply. I mean, 50 years ago, we had 80 media companies. Now we have five, and they're highly politicized. And we have the Fed that controls money. So that we have a government that basically controls the message and the money. Those are massive powers. And then we have, of course, come on, K Street and lobbying that has destroyed democracy. Let's not even get into APAC and dual nationalism and what these are all individual debates, but America is no longer autonomous and democratic. It's financial, it's political, it's centralized. I think that's fairly obvious. China and Russia, at least as autocratic as they have been, uh, are making longer term plays. Russia's debt doesn't compare, doesn't even come close to anything in Europe or the US. Their debt is significantly less. I think it's a debt to GDP of 30%. But China too has problems. China has a massive debt problem. Its groundwater is rotten from over-industrialization, has a massive demographic problem. It's an importer of oil and food. As Kyle Bass has said for years, it needs to find a non-dollar energy solution. It needs to buy dollar and buy oil outside the dollar, which it's doing. So they're thinking longer term ahead. They're avoiding major wars. They're quietly watching the West in general and America in particular shoot itself in the foot and destroy its currency. They've been doing this for decades. And when we weaponized the US dollar in 2022 as a sanction against Putin, again, whatever you think of that war, pro or against it, that was a stupid mistake for our dollar. Everyone in the space knows this. De-dollarization accelerated rapidly after 2022. No one trusts a weaponized reserve currency. It's no coincidence the central bank stacking of gold tripled from 2022 on. The de-dollarization accelerated at a rapid pace from 2022 on. That 45 countries have traded outside the dollar since 2022. That 30 countries are repatriating their gold since 2022. The COMEX has gone completely broken since 2022. Gold has reached all-time highs since 2022. And de-dollarization is obvious now. So all these things China and Russia watched and sat back as we imploded our currency, went into debt, and created policies that actually hurt the dollar. So to your point, there are things from the East, a system and a part of the world that is accustomed to suffering, that is accustomed to patience, that has lived on the sidelines while America was enjoying the 80s and 90s, and now they've been building infrastructure and stacking gold and preparing for what is coming, which is not the end of the dollar, but a whole new trading system, a whole new set of camps, and a whole new set of currency systems outside of the dollar. So they're thinking 20 years ahead, whereas our typical politician, left or right, is thinking the next election cycle
Yep.
and thinking the next way to keep a promise. Anyone who can put something on a black card, an Amex black card, and go to the mall and spend as much as they want is going to be popular until the bill comes in and they can't pay it and they give it to the next generation. And that's what America's guilty of, living way beyond its means with spending, deficits, and debt. That buys, again, temporary prosperity, that buys votes, that buys an illusion of growth. But debt-based growth is an oxymoron because debt-based growth is not growth. It's
It's
like
not growth.
it's like
Yeah.
drunken happiness is not happiness. It's just drunken happiness. And so that's where we are. And we're coming to the end of that now. We're coming to the end of that. And people feel it.
We're gonna live through the unwinding of that, right? If God lets us live, in the next, whatever, 5 years, 10 years. I mean, it's
It's
not
happening
that
as we
far
speak.
off.
It's
Yeah,
actually
I mean,
happening as we speak. It's
it's
literally happening as
happening
we
right
speak.
now, exactly.
Yeah.
So, you know, should the U.S. just repudiate the debt and default? Like obviously a default is coming, like one way or
Hmm.
the other, right? The currency is
Hmm.
going to crack, the default is
Hmm.
coming. It's going to happen voluntarily, or it's going to happen. And this is what this made me
Hmm.
think of it while you were speaking is like
Hmm.
it's an interesting thing to try to parse. Otto von Bismarck talked about this, like
Hmm.
the good luck of like orphans, this and that, whatever the full saying is, and America,
Hmm.
right? Which we have two oceans, we got basically
Right.
like peaceful
Yeah.
neighbors or neighbors that even if they want to do us harm, can't really make too much trouble for us. And so this
Right.
tremendous body of political force, but also
Mhm.
right a tremendous productive population grew
Mhm.
up out of right some pretty bright guys that at least
Sure.
understood the bullshit that we're going through now and how to avoid it and did their
Yep.
best in their time
Mhm.
for whatever faults they had. Everybody's
Mhm.
so happy and eager to like dance on the graves of the men who found it because like, well, they had this fault or that fault, but like no, they got a
Right.
whole bunch of stuff right, obviously, or the US wouldn't have
Right.
been such a tremendous success. And
Right.
so how much of American exceptionalism, which I really
Mhm.
despise as a
Mhm.
phrase, both the
Mhm.
implication of it, but also like the connotation of it, is
Mhm.
just blind, bloody good luck and like historical good fortune vis-a-vis like this tremendous arrogance that just
Mhm.
says, and this comes back to, because you're one of the guys who really deals with this, I think, better than anybody else I've talked to. I don't want to run on too long here because I know I want to be respectful of your time, but it's like how much is just good luck versus this terrible, terrible mentality that just says, well, of course we can invade and kill a million Iraqis. We're
Mhm.
America, right? We're the
Mhm.
good
Mhm.
guys. So if we
Mhm.
do it,
Mhm.
right, there can't be
Mhm.
anything wrong with that.
Mhm.
By definition, it's the right thing to do because we're doing it, right? And
Mhm.
and if we want to print, $10 trillion to get our right, and the whole
Mhm.
2008 thing, like the deeper you look into it, it's like, so wait a second, like the US blew up the financial system and then
Yeah.
essentially stiffed everybody else,
Yeah.
right? This has been
Yeah.
going on over and over and over. And John Conley's famous saying, right, in 71,
Right.
yeah, it's our dollar, it's your problem, right?
Exactly.
So how
Exactly.
you like that? Put that in your pipe and smoke it, right? And this
Right.
this arrogance of like we can get away with anything because we said so, right?
Right.
Going away very clearly, turning away from what was a kind of principled approach at some point,
Mhm.
which was, look,
Mhm.
we're doing these things because they're the right thing to do, right? And there's
Mhm.
power in that. And so,
Mhm.
like what I see happening, all of that is to say, if I wrap up here,
Mhm.
reality is going to cast the deciding vote in all of
Mhm.
this. And so
Mhm.
if default is coming, like what
Mhm.
I know there's no way out, but what
Mhm.
would be the prudent thing? Let's
Mhm.
imagine that there's like somebody comes from outer space and we
Mhm.
all go, please, you have the wisdom
Mhm.
to solve this. What would he or she or it do to sort
Mhm.
of like how do we get to the other side of whatever shit show is right on the
Mhm.
horizon, I guess,
Yeah.
is really, and then, what should individuals be doing? We'll wrap up with that.
Yeah, these are really important questions, real important context historically. Again, I think just to your first point, Benjamin Franklin walked out of Philadelphia when when we signed the Constitution, and they were saying, "Thank God for democracy," and he warned a passerby, "Well, all democracies die, and it's usually by suicide." And when did America die? Because I do think the Thomas Jeffersons, the Hamiltons, the Madisons, the John Adamses, they had seen suffering. They had seen what Europe did to itself. Certainly, Benjamin Franklin saw what Europe was doing to itself in France. So did Thomas Jefferson.
Hmm.
They wanted to avoid that by creating three branches of government, by having a free press, a true First Amendment. We've killed that with the media and the mass media and the centralized media. We've killed First Amendment. We've killed so many other of the Bill of Rights, and we killed the strong dollar. We killed the currency backed by gold and silver. Again, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So we did commit suicide as a country. We started with great principles, great visions, divisions of power. Now you can stack the court, stack the Congress, stack the White House. You have lobbying. You have a central bank, which Jefferson said I'd fight to the death to prevent, and we have it anyway. Wilson signed our lives away in 1913 with the Fed. I think it was one of the worst days in our history. So we did this to ourselves. The question is, what can we do now, fast forwarding to 2025? First, we have to be honest that we can't have debt without tears. We can't have a debased currency without some type of constructive destruction, as the Austrian economists have taught us. You're saying, will we default and what can we do? We're already defaulting because if you look at the inflation measure that Volcker used in the 1980s, and thank God for guys like John Williams who tell the truth about inflation, it's not a gold bug conspiracy. We're looking at least 11% inflation as measured by the same scale that Volcker used when he was trying to fight inflation. Now, if we have 11% inflation and across the entire yield curve from short-term treasuries to 30-year treasuries, you can get 4 to 5 or even 6% yield. If you have 11% inflation, that's a negative 5% return at least on your US Treasury, the most sacred bond, the risk-free return, which I call return-free risk. That means we're already defaulting because when you have a negative returning IOU from Uncle Sam in real terms, inflation-adjusted terms, that's negative, that constructively is a default. So the US is already defaulting on its IOU, its US Treasury, which is why the world since 2014 has been net dumping US Treasuries and net stacking physical gold. That's just a fact. I'm not a fan of the BIS, which now gives gold tier one status. I'm not a fan of the Federal Reserve, the ECB, or any central banker, and certainly not the one out of Basel. But they are telling you what they're doing. They're showing you what they're doing. They're choosing physical gold over US treasuries and US dollars and fiat money. So, what do citizens need to do? Don't listen to what the Fed says. Do what they're doing. Look
Yep.
what central banks are doing. Look what the East is doing. You don't have to like China or like Russia. They've been stacking gold quietly for decades, and they've accelerated that since we weaponized the dollar in 2022. So
Purchasing Dore from South,
absolutely.
Latin America, yeah, and having it shipped without, obviously they don't report any of that, like however many ounces Dore is, if I'm not mistaken, that's the slurry and the rock, right? That's mined
Right.
but not yet minted and
No,
gone through the
so
yeah.
the citizens or the people watching this, again, middle class to upper class, anyone who self-educated themselves like you did when you were buying gold at 1050, for God's sakes, God bless, it's brilliant. More people can still do that at 35, 3,700 because gold's going to go much higher, not in a straight line. But the reason I know that is because I know history. So we've already defaulted, but we won't publicly default by just not paying back. So we can't grow our way out of debt. When you get debt to GDP past 120, 110, 100%, David Hume warned us of this. Jefferson warns us of this. Reinhardt and Rogart have warned us of this. You can't grow. The growth is cut by at least a third. So you can't grow our way out of debt. GDP and tax receipts aren't going to get ourselves out of this debt. We can't officially default. So it's inflate or die. We have to inflate away our currency, debase our currency, run negative real rates. In other words, destroy the currency to monetize our debt. We've been doing that slowly. It's only going to get worse, which means the purchasing power of the dollar is only going to get worse. The dollar is only going to get weaker in absolute terms, regardless of its relative DXY measurement. So this is not a gold bug case. This is history in motion. This is the hard math of a country with unsustainable debt. We will debase our currency. There is talk of a gold revaluation, and won't get into all the weeds, where the Fed has these 260 million ounces of gold in these certificates, and then they can revalue them at 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 to basically monetize their gold certificates to pay down their debt. Even that is a short-term solution, but not a long-term. It's fantastic for us gold guys because your gold's going to go much higher. I think that's likely to come. Judy Shelton is talking about a gold-backed U.S. Treasury, which is a symptom of how unloved and untrusted our dollar really is. That we've been looking at this as Michael Hartnett at B of A says it's inevitable that we're going to have to revalue gold and bring gold back into the system after we ruined it 54 years ago.
It
But I
feels
think
like it. It feels like it is inevitable, right?
it
The
does.
nothing else is going to put a stop to the madness.
And there's something that just came out last week that's getting a lot of spin. It could be clickbait, but this guy Anton Kobayakov, who's a Russian minister, who went out publicly and called the bluff on the U.S. And he basically said that the U.S. is publicly he's publicly saying that the U.S. is intentionally shoving the dollar into stablecoin, into tokenized coins, and then it will devalue those stable coins from a 1-to-1 ratio with the dollar to probably one to a half dollar, so that your dollar will lose value overnight. Now we've done that in the 1930s under Roosevelt when he confiscated gold, revalued it from 20 to $35. It wiped out 40% of the US dollar basically overnight. In 1971, when we decoupled from gold, which was supposed to be temporary, that's 54 years in the making, that was effectively a default on the US dollar, which lost 50% of its purchasing power in the next 10 years. And what guys like Kobayako are saying are the US is going to pump it into stable coin, then it's going to devalue the stable coin, then it's going to revalue gold by tens of thousands of dollars. Now, again, this could happen. It happened in the 1930s. It happened in the 1970s. Now we really do have our backs against the wall. But whether it's what Anton Kobayakov is saying or whether it's what the IMF said during COVID, wherever you talk to, even the crypto guys and the Bitcoin guys know at the end, they all see gold as the final result. I'm not saying that because I run a gold shop out of Zurich. I'm saying that because I'm a former hedge fund guy, allocator guy who's just tracking history in the dollar. That's my honest opinion. Does that mean I'm absolutely right? No, you should challenge my opinion. But whatever happens, whether it's a great reset through the IMF, which they warned about during the COVID nonsense, and they blamed COVID on they blamed our debt on COVID rather than every freaking politician west of the world. I mean, that was such a cop out. But they've admitted, though, the IMF has admitted, and the BIS has admitted that gold is going to be central to the next whatever comes out of this. The BRICS clearly know that already. The East has been doing this already. No matter how you turn it, whether it's revaluation, whether it's a global reset, whether it's a Bretton Woods 2.0, a Plaza Accords 2.0, or this stablecoin ruse, it doesn't matter which one actually or all of the above fall together or come together. All of them talk about debasement of the currency and gold as a solution. So to me, whether I'm a shoe salesman, whether I'm a dental hygienist, whether I'm a hedge fund manager, whether I'm a brain surgeon, you need to understand gold to protect yourself from this melting ice cube fiat dollar that you hold, or fiat euro, or fiat currency that you measure your wealth in. It is dying right in front of our eyes if you're
Yeah.
paying attention. Gold doesn't go in a straight line, but we are only in chapter one at 36, 3,700. This is
Yeah.
just the beginning. That is not me trying to get you to become a client in Zurich. Most of the people listening can't be a client. You should still look at gold. So why am I saying this? Because I believe it. And I can't come up with a better option. Certainly, Bitcoin's annualized returns because of one massive 5,000% year is a great speculation asset. It is not a store of value. I'm sorry. It's standard deviation. It's not a store of value. It is a great speculation asset. So I'm not anti Bitcoin to be pro gold. I'm saying, but gold can only go higher because the dollar can only get weaker. And even the
Yeah.
Bitcoin camp agrees with that. So to answer a long answer to your short question, we have broken ourselves as a system. It's our own fault. It's a suicide. We've slowly gotten away from our founding fathers' principle, from Article 1 to the Bill of Rights. We have done that. If you study that, you'll see it. This is nothing new in history. It happened in France. It happened in ancient Rome. We've debased our currency. We have social unrest. There's more centralization. The best protection from ancient Rome to today is physical gold. Get it. Don't look at the price because it's not a speculation asset. You're buying for 10, 20 years out, not for the next quarter. You're not comparing it to Nvidia or Bitcoin or Microsoft or Lucent or anything. You're comparing it to the dollar or the euro or the Canadian or Australian dollar in your hand, which is insulting you. It's insulting you
Yeah.
because your government has insulted you and lied to you about what they've done and blamed it on a virus or blamed it on a bad guy in Russia. It's their own policy. And I think if you get informed about that, you'll understand this more as rather just being sold to by a gold bug in Zurich.
That's damn good advice, my friend. I think we got to wrap up on that. By the way,
All right,
what
buddy.
sport did you get a scholarship for? What did you play when you were
Oh,
alive?
that was baseball. That was
Baseball.
baseball.
Oh,
Yeah,
nice,
good
nice.
Michigan boy,
Yeah,
Midwest.
very
Yeah.
good, very
Now I'm
good.
a
Yeah.
wanker playing polo,
S-
it's pathetic.
Well, we were in Buenos Aires last November for for
Yeah.
the Mavericks
Oh, yeah,
gathering, and they
right.
had the
In
World
Palermo.
Cup of polo in
Yeah.
Buenos Aires, and we went to the
Yeah.
Hippodrome, and right next door was the polo grounds, and I had never seen it, not on TV, not ever,
Oh,
and I was
yeah.
just enamored. I mean, it's like a
Oh, yeah.
cavalry charge every 45 seconds,
That's what it
guys.
is.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's what
literally
it
what it
is.
is. It's cavalry. It's not a sword, it's a mallet. My
Yeah.
great grandfather on my mother's side was a cavalryman in the Civil War, and that's just kind of what turned me on to it in my little romanticized way. But yeah, Palermo is that was a great match. I talked to Andrew about that. I really wanted to go. Andrew, one of your
Yeah,
Maverick partners.
it
Man,
was
it's that's the highest level of sports,
it was
polo or
epic.
not. It's epic. Yeah,
Yeah.
fantastic. I'm jealous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll hope we run into you down the road.
All right, buddy.
I would like to make a trip back to Switzerland and just stomp around my old grounds.
Yeah.
I had such a
Yeah.
grand time. That really was the beginning of my adventure, and
Good.
it's how I
Yeah.
got here today. So it really
Excellent.
treated me well. So thank you again. How do people get in touch with you? Well, I'll put it in the notes here. You want to just
Okay.
tell people real fast in case there are folks who need wealth protection.
Sure.
These guys are it.
Yeah, I mean, all of my articles and interviews and Egon von Greyer's articles and interviews are there. It's vongreyers.gold. That's a long name. You could just be vg.gold, and our other URL is Gold Switzerland. And we've got myself, Egon, Alistair McLeod as an advisor, Ronnie Sturfula from the Gold Trust Report as an advisor,
Wonderful.
Grant Williams. I mean, between Grant Williams and Ronnie and Alistair and Egon, I've got the smartest guys in the room as allies on this space. And
Yeah, that's quite a squad. Yeah. Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
just wonderful. Couldn't
Yeah.
be happier. Yeah.
Good for you. Well, I'll put all that in the notes, and you'll be able to get in touch with Matt and his team if you need that kind of service. And thank you again very much for your time. I really enjoyed that talk. Thanks, buddy.
Thank you, Tane. Real
We'll,
pleasure.
we'll hope to talk again soon. Thanks.
Love
Yep.
it.
Take
Yep.
care.